Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Exercise is Bullshit. I'm your host, Logan Emmett Hurley, and I'm so excited to be joined today by the young, up and coming Ryan Burke out of Lehman University in New York, New York. Ryan joined us today. He just recently got his master's degree finished under the tutelage of Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, among others. They're doing a lot of great work over there at Lehman. Ryan, why don't you say hi, and we'll learn a little bit more about you before we dive into this super interesting paper that you were part of.
Absolutely. Yeah. First, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on, Logan. I'm really excited to dive into the research around the cooling paper. But yeah, as you said, I just finished up my master's degree at Lehman College in the Bronx, New York, under Dr. Schoenfeld, and primarily spent the last 2 years there working in the applied muscle development lab, carrying out studies on all things related to resistance training and muscular adaptations.
Yeah, and for those of our listeners that don't know, Lehman is probably the leading institution, which is funny because it's this little small college in the Bronx, doing some of the most advanced research in exercise science in the world. And some of it's a little redundant, right? Occasionally, it's like, well, what causes muscles to grow? What should we be doing these simple things, or should we be doing these complicated things? But I think it's so important to add to the literature and see, like, is this just bro science, or is this actually something that has some merit to it? And it's interesting to see, the time that I've been following Dr. Schoenfeld, how much of sort of bodybuilding lore has kind of, it's not all accurate, right? But a lot of it sort of come to light to be like, oh, well, the bros maybe had something going there. So what has your experience been with before getting into Lehman, and kind of just your exposure to exercise science, or I guess just bro science in general?
Yeah, so I first got into exercise, I guess, as most people do through playing sports. I played a bunch of sports growing up, and as I got into high school, I'm not the biggest, tallest, or fastest guy on the field or on the mat, but I was always looking to find ways to improve my performance on the field. So obviously the main way of doing that could have been in the weight room. So I got interested in lifting weights, strength and conditioning. So found a real passion for that early on. And then I did my undergrad at Ohio State, and I majored in exercise science there, and also had a minor in nutrition. So I think my junior year I got involved in research there, and it was more of like health and behavioral type of research, but nonetheless very interesting, and got my feet wet in that area, and I really started to have a passion for academia. So once I was done there, I'm from New Jersey, so I was looking to find schools for a master's degree or master's program on the East Coast. And one of those happened to be Lehman College. Like you said, it's a very small school. I never really even heard of it until I listened to a podcast with Dr. Schoenfeld on, I think it was like Barbell Shrugged or something like that. And I heard him at the end say, yeah, if you apply to Lehman College, if you're interested in carrying out research and joining our master's program. And he said it was in New York. So I was like, oh, well, I have grandparents in Brooklyn, and I'm from the East Coast. So checked it out, and ended up being a match, and really happy that I ended up there because love all my peers and friends that I met there, and I'm very fortunate for the guidance from Dr. Schoenfeld, as well as again the other research assistants in that lab. So yeah, that's kind of what landed me there, and I just finished that up. So here we are now.
Yeah, it's interesting that little school has become kind of a mecca for all things exercise science. And I do want to say I appreciate you just saying Ohio State instead of the Ohio State, because there's very few things that drive me more crazy in this world than a-holes from Ohio State saying the Ohio State. So, but you're a Jersey boy, so if you were from Columbus, things might be different. So
I
no, no,
for a
that's
second there, for a second there, I was about to say the Ohio State, but I was like, yeah, I'll just go with Ohio State.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Maybe if you're playing football on Sundays, you can get away with it. But for the mere mortals among us, yeah, it's probably just OSU is fine. No, that's great, man. And just as far as Lehman goes, and working with Brad, and obviously there's so many other great researchers that are either part-time professors there, or come through and do collaborative work. Obviously, Dr. Pack is a good friend of the program. Milo Wolf's a buddy of mine too. So many young bright minds that are collaborating with that team. What does your future look like now that you've graduated from there? I know I've had some of your colleagues and former students, maybe that you've crisscrossed in the past with, that have gone on to other universities. Are you thinking about maybe pursuing a PhD at Lehman? I know they're talking about launching a program. What are sort of the next steps looking like for you?
Yeah, so I would have loved to continue at Lehman. The goal is a PhD, but I'm from South Jersey, which is a little farther from New York, so it's hard for me to stay out there for another 4 5 years, whatever it is. So I'm going to be pursuing a PhD at Rutgers University in the fall. So that'll I'll be working in their applied biomechanics lab and help teaching there as well, and that'll be allow me to be a little closer to home. So yeah, that's the plan going forward.
That's awesome. So you've already gotten into Rutgers. You're gonna start working there and working. That's awesome, man. Do you have any
Yep, I'll start
ideas
up in
of what
September.
you'd Nice. Do you have an idea of what you'd like your dissertation to be, or is it too early in the process to really have an eye on that?
Yeah, I have a couple ideas. It's a little early for me to like pinpoint one. Flirting with a couple ideas. I would like to stay in the realm of resistance training, but I'm also interested in concurrent training. So I am, and like I said earlier, the what really got me into this field in the first place was sport performance as well. So interested in delving into topics in that area. So we'll see once it gets closer. But as of now, my interests are kind of broad, so I don't have like a sole focus yet.
Gotcha. And for our listeners that aren't sure what concurrent training is, that would be like doing a marathon while also, weightlifting, or soccer players who are also weightlifting, doing multiple different avenues of training at the same time. So thinking cardiovascular adaptations and how that interacts with resistance training adaptations. So that's super interesting because there is a dearth of research in that area. I mean, it's come a long way, I feel like, but that's certainly something that would be interesting to see going forward too. So, well, that's exciting, man. I'd love to before we really dive into this cooling down paper, which is something that I'm really interested in because my background, I came from like climate controlled resistance training. So I don't know if you're familiar with like super slow modalities at all. Um, a
No.
little bit different. We can talk about it a little when we get into the cooling down paper, but what is something that you've sort of changed your mind on, right? When I think of the
Hmm.
really the idea of this podcast, it's challenging conceptions, right? It's making sure that we're not being married to our ideas, and it's having that scientific mindset. And I just like saying the word bullshit, so I added that in there as well. So, what is something that you were pretty sure about, let's say 2 to 5 years ago, that you made a pretty monumental shift on, maybe since being a researcher?
I wouldn't say, I would say if anything, it's more kind of what you just explained. Maybe not anything specific, but just in how I approach research, or not even research, but just approach individuals, especially on social media, and how they deliver um, or make claims, I should say. So like exactly what you said, like a couple years ago, I didn't know how to really interpret a research paper. So, so I would rely on some of these people on social media who were making very confident claims about certain topics, not knowing whether or not it was accurate, or how truthful it was behind the claims that they were making. So I would say the biggest thing that I've changed my mind on is that I think the field in general, it's a very new field if you think about it. Exercise science hasn't been around for that long compared to a lot of other disciplines. So I would say it's that we don't know nearly as much as I originally thought we did, or at least, people like to make confident claims, and it makes you think that we have, like you were saying, like we feel like we have all these things figured out, and that's why it's kind of funny when, like, for example, the superset study, you see people in the comments be like, "Oh, bro, we knew this 10 years ago, doing it in the trenches and stuff." And like, yeah, sure, like maybe you try that on the floor and it works or whatnot, but until we have like solid evidence backing up a certain idea, we don't know for sure, right? So I would say that there's a lot of things out there that we think we know, but or I thought we knew that we don't. And I say one that sticks out the most is just the idea of the hormone hypothesis. I don't know why that just kind of rings something in my head, but like a couple of years ago, I remember seeing a TikTok or something, or maybe it was an Instagram reel before TikTok out there, that was like, if you want to grow your biceps, do them immediately after you do a set of squats, because that's when you have the highest increase in like testosterone release systemically. And that the logic, like the logic sounds, it doesn't, it sounds legit when you think about it, like, oh, that kind of makes sense, acutely. But when you look at like the long-term research, I think you've had Stu Phillips on before, but I know he's done a lot of work in this area. Literally, I think he's done a study on that exact idea of doing like a leg press high volume followed up by bicep curls. I could be wrong, don't quote me on that. But either way, there's a decent amount of evidence suggesting that increases in systemic hormones don't necessarily correlate with changes in muscle growth, and that's backed by a lot of other literature comparing like low load to high load training to failure, right? So I would say things like that, and that's a perfect example of like somebody I saw that some influencer made that post saying like if you do this, you'll get more growth in your biceps, um, even though there's peer-reviewed research out there suggesting otherwise. So there's one example that kind of stands out, but I would say in general, that's kind of what comes to mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great one and one I've not actually heard yet. I've had Stu on a few times on previous podcasts, not on this new podcast yet. But yeah, I just think taking that that scientific mindset of just like, well, hold on, what does the research actually say? One of the biggest wake up calls for me was a few years back. I'm blanking on the gentleman's name now, but I believe James Fisher out of Solon University was part of this review too. But they looked at the ACSM position stand and basically just tore it to shreds because a lot of the governing bodies in strength and conditioning in general have built science just on claims, right? So there's like one study that they did in 1950 that kind of maybe showed some effect, and everybody's been quoting it and citing it ever since. So whatever the issue is, like one that stands out to me is like 1 rep maxes, and just obviously the repetition continuum, but 1 rep maxes in particular, like there's so much just confidence when people talk about like, oh yeah, you get this many reps at this percentage of 1 RM, and it's like, but do we know that for sure? Because as like a practical application, like somebody who's been in the trenches, like you have been as well, because I know you train people too. It's like, I don't necessarily think that you can correlate 80% with a specific rep range from person to person. There's huge variability. So that's just another simple example of something that's like you see these things and people are really great at, I always think of like flat earthers too. Like, how do people fall for that? It's like, well, somebody is
Hmm.
very convincing. In the case of exercise influencers, they probably have a tank top on or they're shirtless. They look like the freaking Liver King. And you're like, obviously, this guy knows what he's talking about. And before you've ever read a research paper, done any research on your own, which you obviously have done a lot of now, it's very easy to fall for that and fall for the fallacy of thinking that somebody's an expert. And then things make kind of logical sense. Like that does sort of, oh, you increase your testosterone. That obviously makes sense. But we know those acute increases don't actually correlate with outcomes very much at all. So yeah, super interesting. I love that. Let's dive into this paper a little bit. This is a recently published. This was for your thesis, right? For your master's thesis,
The palm cooling
or the
one,
superset paper was. Yeah,
the superset paper was correct.
gotcha. So
Yes.
this was just part of your master's work. So um,
Yep.
is that correct? Yep. So this paper was called Cooling Down to Level Up. So does interset palm or sole cooling enhance resistance training performance? So give us just sort of the background. What was the impetus for this paper? What made you interested in the idea of sole or palm cooling? And how did you kind of come up with the topic for this and for further investigation? And I'm slightly familiar with how Brad kind of like has a team committee vibe of like how to pick research papers, but I'm wondering if that was the case for this. So please let us know.
Yeah, so this one, I'll be honest, kind of keep it on track with what we were just talking about in terms of some people saying things very confidently. Before I was even, I think a year out before I joined the master's program, I heard Dr. Andrew Huberman on a podcast talk about this idea of palm cooling and how I think it was something like increased like work volume of the amount of dips you could perform by like over 200%. I'm just throwing out a random number. But either way, like very crazy results.
A
I think he
lot.
said it on like, yeah, by a lot. There you go. Which were comparable with like performance enhancing drugs, some of these results. So yeah, I mean, you hear that, and I was like, oh my gosh, how is this is like the best kept secret that no one's known. Like, how is this not more utilized within strength and conditioning? And so I heard that it kind of stayed in my head for for over a year, and then eventually I joined the program at Lehman, and um, obviously the master's program is usually I mean, I guess it changed depends on the college, but ours was 2 years, and usually the last semester you either do your capstone or your thesis. So Dr. Schoenfeld's a big proponent of always saying, come up with your thesis idea as early as possible, or like start thinking about it. So my first semester at Lehman, he said start thinking about a thesis idea, and that was like one of the first ones that came into my head. It was like, oh, maybe something around palm cooling. um and originally that's what I was going to do for my thesis, but I ended up doing the supersets, for a couple of different reasons. A big one too was it was very difficult to get like an actual cooling unit. As well, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but there's specific cooling devices that are made that can be difficult to access. So there was that, and then a couple other reasons as to why I didn't end up pursuing that. But anyways, I had a class where we had to pick a topic for a research paper on some type of controversial topic in exercise science, and I picked palm cooling. So I ended up diving into the research to see like what's the actual deal here, and ended up being some contrasting evidence, some limitations in the literature, which we'll touch on, I'm sure. But um, that ended up being like my final paper for this class, back in I think a year and a half ago now, and we ended up trying after that. We ended up bringing on um, someone who actually conducts research on this topic, Dr. Gerard McMahon, out of a school in Northern Ireland. So Dr. Schoenfeld, he's a colleague of his, so he brought him on the project to help condense the paper down, refine it, and everything, and ended up forming into a narrative review, which ended up attempting to get published, and it got published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. So that's kind of the origin of that idea and how it evolved into the paper that's currently out there now.
So a couple questions on that. One, it looks like it's just the three of you as the authors listed on there. So did everybody in that class write a paper about a controversial topic?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Oh
So
wow.
there, like
Okay.
my topic was just palm cooling. Other people did other like I'm trying to remember something like someone did something on like our warm-ups actually effective. So you picked your own topic that had some type of controversial claim, and then you basically had to go into the literature and come out with some type of or report the evidence and come out with some type of conclusion or consensus.
And this is why Brad is the most dominant researcher in the field because his name is on every fucking paper that gets published out of Lehman. That's awesome. Did you actually experiment with this before you went into school? Like you mentioned hearing that Huberman episode. Did you like take ice bags to the gym and try to do some dips? And how did that work out? Like, what was your experience with that?
Yeah, so I do mostly when I'm home. I mostly work out I have like a garage gym, and it can get pretty hot in there in the summer, as you would imagine. And so I experimented a little bit with like passing a cold. I put like a water bottle in the freezer or whatever, and I'd pass that back and forth between my hands. But I will say like I never actually recorded any different changes in repetition. Like I never gave it like a fair shot. And also there was a little bit of aspect of like I know this already, like that placebo effect thing. So I wanted to for the longest time, wanted to get my one of my best friends to he's not aware of this at all, and somehow figure out a way to do like a couple trials with him, almost like an anecdotal trial, but also give him some other type of like sham control um intervention for placebo, like give him like a lukewarm bottle and then like a cold bottle on a different day, and not really tell him which was supposed to work. But it never ended up working out. So but now that this paper's come out, it's kind of, and now I'm back home in the summertime, maybe I will play around with it and see what happens. But yeah, never really gave it a fair shot of myself.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about the data collection. Obviously, this is a narrative review. Um, and I mentioned I had a little experience with cooling, and it's not specifically like cooling palms, but as we'll
Hmm.
talk about, some of the potential mechanisms of why this could work is sort of a thought and a theory of a guy named Ken Hutchins, who's the founder of super slow exercise. So he believed in keeping an extremely cold, climate-controlled environment when you're exercising. So the gym that I first worked at, that I learned all about high intensity training and evidence based exercise, was 62 degrees. and we had high pressure fans that would blow on the person. And the idea was essentially that you prevent overheating, you prevent that internal like central nervous system kind of shutting down from just your core temperature rising too much. And anecdotally, like it seemed to work, but I've never seen a research paper like doing it that way. So this was especially interesting to me because I feel like if you go to a gym that's 85 fucking degrees and you try to work out, like it's really hard to get a good workout in, or you get like 3 sets in and that's about it because you're just completely overwhelmed. But you go to a gym that's 62 where it's like, I had to keep my sweatshirt on when you start off, and you find how fast you actually cool yourself up to where the temperature doesn't even bug you at all anymore. So this paper especially just stood out to me, and when I saw it, I knew I just wanted to chat with you. So what what did this kind of look like from a research perspective? You mentioned there wasn't a huge amount of research on the topic. How did you go about collecting this data? What were kind of some of your search terms? And then how did you decide what to include and not to include in the actual research selection?
Yeah. So basically, in order to be included in the study, it just had to be any type of basically interset palm cooling. So the cooling had palm or sole cooling, excuse me. So it had to be some type of cooling application to either the palms or the feet in between sets of resistance exercise. So there's also like maybe we'll touch on a little bit, but there's also some research on like aerobic exercise, but we that wasn't the topic of this paper. So that's a whole nother topic. But for this was just purely resistance training, and it was just like a PubMed search looking for any topics on the study: distal cooling, palm cooling, sole cooling, resistance exercise, key terms like that. And then a lot of it too was looking at a big help of it was actually Dr. McMahon, because when he came on, I mean, I would consider him one of the experts on the topic because he's carried out, at least to my knowledge, published the two most recent studies on palm cooling's effects on resistance training. So he's obviously very aware of the research. So his input helped as well in finding any studies that I might have missed or whatnot. And obviously as well, it went through a peer review process, which through the Strength and Conditioning Journal, and they helped give feedback in terms of potentially, I think, like one study that they found that I hadn't found in my own search that they provided to me. So I would say that's kind of the general gist of how we went about diving into the research and finding the specific studies for the paper.
So we talked offline before we hopped on here about kind of having this, again, this scientific mindset, and it's sort of approaching all research with the idea of the null hypothesis. Was that sort of the mentality you took? And can you tell us a little bit about sort of that mindset from a exercise scientist perspective, so our listeners can be a little more familiar with like why that's such a good sort of perspective to have, especially when you're going into research?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's good or bad, but I'd say it's just good in that I mean, everyone has some type of bias, right? And you could lie and say I don't have a bias, but I would say people naturally do. But I'd say going in with the expectation of like having the null hypothesis probably minimizes any biases. But a lot of times, at least in the research we carry out in our lab, that's controlled for. Like, there's nothing that my biases don't matter that much, because Dr. Schoenfeld's the one who does the ultrasound scans for muscle growth, and he's completely blinded to the group allocation. So he's not allowed like in the lab during the actual data collection process, because he can't know which subject is in which group. So he only sees them pre-study and post-study and has no idea which group they're in. Same with like the statisticians we have on the project. But I guess I would say, in terms of expectation, that's kind of the reason why it might be beneficial. But at the end of the day, like my own biases don't matter that much. I mean, maybe for something like a narrative review, it could, um, and it might show in the paper. But for me, going into the paper, at least how I wrote it, I tried to best reflect both sides of the like pro palm cooling, and like the other side of the palm cooling, in that it doesn't work. I tried to best reflect both sides fairly. Going into it, to be quite honest, I wanted it to show that palm cooling was effective, because who wouldn't want to or increase the amount of reps you could perform in your 1RM, like just by cooling your hands? Like, that's awesome. And because I originally saw or heard about this through Andrew Huberman, prior to me getting really involved into research, I guess I had that bias going into my research or literature search. But once I started going through the literature and breaking down the studies and all that, I started seeing some issues with some of the papers that showed performance enhancing effect, um, as well as even some of the two studies or several studies that didn't show any effect. And I don't want to spoil anything and give away what my ultimate conclusion is, but I would say that was how I felt going into it, at least, is that I
Yeah.
thought that I was hoping that it would be effective. Yeah.
Did you? And I think that's fair as a person who wants to get more jacked. We all want to find that magic bullet. So, did you
hmm
end up finding and maybe going back and listening to Humerman and finding the study that he was talking about? Was that included in this? And if so, which
Yeah,
one? Which
yeah.
one was it?
Yeah, so I think the main reason why like he was a big proponent on talking about it is because it was at he's I believe he's a researcher out of Stanford, Huberman, and
Yeah.
one of the early papers on the topic of palm cooling was also out of Stanford. So I think it's one of his colleagues. The study is by Gran and colleagues, and I think it was like a 2012 study. It's interesting. It's a paper. It's one paper, but it consists of like four different studies they carried out in their lab, but they published it as one paper, if that makes sense. So that is the one that he is referring to that looked at the only long-term outcomes that we have on, they looked at strength outcomes, they looked at increases in like the amount of pull-ups you can perform over a 6-week period, and then as well as some acute studies looking at just the total amount of repetitions you can perform in the bench press and whatnot. So those were the studies that he was referring to.
Gotcha. And just talk to me a little bit about the setup of some of these studies. Obviously, we don't have to go into super detail. Oh, I meant to say as well, you mentioned wanting to be really objective in how you wrote the paper, and I thought you guys did a great job of that, of giving both sides. Like,
Thank you.
here's what they said. Sounds encouraging, but wait, some limitations here, right? Maybe they should have done this, should have done that. So I thought it was is very well written, and I think you did a good job of kind of straddling the fence on not letting your biases filter into there. So talk to me a little bit about what is a typical subject design. Obviously, there was some variability. It seems like one of the big differences in a lot of these studies was the time that they were actually cooling palms or soles in between sets. So just to give a big picture overview, most of these, and correct me if I'm wrong, were multi-set studies. So you're looking at, say, chest press or bench press, rather, you're doing 3, 4, 5 sets, a certain percent of one rep max, and then X amount of time in one group or another in recovery. And that group is either cooling palms or soles, or they're not, or sometimes they've got a neutral condition, and it's sort of different variances of that. But what else are we missing? Like, what were some of the other modalities that they were using? Can it paint us a picture of how some of these studies looked?
Sure. Yeah. And first off, thank you for saying that about the paper. But yeah. So some of the ways, like I said, it's literally as simple as just you perform. We'll say perform a set of bench press, and normally you rest for a couple minutes and then perform another set, right? So the only difference here is that during the cooling condition, they're applying some type of cold substance to the palm or cold application to the palms or the soles of the feet, and you could do that in a couple different ways. So there's actually been a couple different cooling units or devices that have been made for this purpose. I think there's, I'm not exactly sure of the company names, but anyway, some of them are like, imagine putting like a glove on or something like that, and it's connected to some device that circulates cooled water across the palm. Um, and those special devices are cool because you could actually manipulate the temperature and control it. But those units are very expensive, and from what I know, I don't think they're like commercially available. I think like major sports teams and certain organizations can only purchase them. I could be wrong; that might have changed since last check. But there's also some research looking at more practical approaches because obviously, if I go to a commercial gym, I'm not bringing a massive cooling unit. I mean, you could, I guess, but that's probably not very pragmatic. So there's also been some stuff looking at cold packs, so like using ice packs. There's been some sole cooling studies where they have buckets of water and they immerse their feet into those buckets. And they can like monitor the temperature with a thermometer and then add crushed ice as needed to maintain that ideal temperature, because all these studies also were carried out within the temperature of the water itself was between 10 degrees and 15 degrees Celsius. So they were able to monitor that temperature. But obviously, the more practical methods, like the buckets of water and the cold packs, can be more prone to fluctuations in temperature just because they're not as well controlled. But you also, although you sacrifice that, you get a more practical way to use it compared to the cooling unit. It's a little more complex, but you can control that temperature. But yeah, and most of the studies were between, it was anywhere between 1 to 3 minutes of cooling between sets. So they all rested between 2 to 3 minutes between sets of an exercise. Um, Two studies, I believe, applied cooling for one out of those 3 minutes, and then several other studies applied cooling from anywhere from 2 to 2.5 to 3 minutes between sets.
So, what were some of the takeaways? What were some of the outcome measures that they were looking at? I thought it was interesting what they were measuring. Obviously, like volume load seemed to be one, RPE, rate of perceived exertion. What were some of the other things? And talk to us a little bit about what maybe the thought process was of measuring those specific metrics.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say the main outcomes assessed, like you said, were volume load, or the amount of repetitions you could perform to failure. So, sticking with the bench press example, they would have subjects come in, and let's say they had their 10 RM load, right? The load that they can perform 10 reps um, for before failing, and they'd have you come in and perform that condition either with cooling or without cooling, and then do that for 4 or 5 sets, whatever it is, and then look at the amount of reps you perform on each set, and then compare that to how many reps you could perform in a non-cooling condition. And then they looked at, like you said, RPE, so rating of perceived exertion. They looked at EMG, so surface EMG. That's a way, it's like, think of like electrodes on whatever muscles are being worked, and it can give us insight into like the neural drive to the muscle itself. So they looked at that. I would say those were the main outcomes. One study actually looked at kind of similar to RPE, but they called it like a arousal scale. So basically, in between sets, prior to, like, say after set one, I did the cooling, and then I was about to go to set two. Right before that set, they showed me a scale. They would show me a scale. They'd be like, "What's your perceived activation?" With like 6 being the highest, being like excited, and then like 1 being relaxed. So it looked at cooling's effect on, I guess you could say, like perceived like vigor, or how ready you are to go again. Um, so I thought that was pretty unique. I haven't seen that too often in other papers. But I would say those were the main outcomes looked at, just because almost all the studies were acute, so like short-term studies, just looking at um, acute performance. But yeah,
So, everybody wants to know what were the outcomes? What happened? Who did what? Did it work? Did it work, Ryan? Ryan, did it work?
so I'll cut to the chase first and just say that ultimately the conclusion is it's kind of indifferent. There's a lot of studies actually showing that cooling was effective in improving the amount of repetitions you can perform to failure compared to a non-cooling, whereas some studies showed no additional effect. And I'd say we could start with just like the two, or the bench press studies. So the simplest one was, as far as I know, it's the two earliest studies on resistance training on this topic were by Kwan and colleagues, and they did one study in males, and then the same exact study but only in females, and they had exactly the protocol I just described. They came in and performed 85% of 1 RM on the bench press for 4 sets. One condition was cooling, palm cooling with one of those cooling units. The other condition was just passive recovery. But I should note that they did, so the non-cooling condition, they still used that cooling unit on their hand, but they controlled it so that it was like a thermoneutral condition, right? So, which is good, because there's obviously a risk for placebo effect if you're just passively recovering and then just sitting there, and then the one time you do the cooling, now you have some type of treatment being applied to you, so that can do things psychologically, maybe boost performance indirectly. So having that sham intervention group controls for that potential placebo effect, and increases the internal validity of the study. So just like a side note, that's important to note there. And they showed that like they showed a modest boost in the amount of total repetitions performed in the palm cooling condition compared to the non-cooling condition. We're talking, I think, somewhere between like one in both studies, 1 to like 2.5 reps or something like that on average. So um, a boost in the amount of reps you can perform, nothing crazy or anything like that. Um, and they also showed a greater EMG of the synergist muscles. So they showed greater EMG of the triceps and the front delts compared in the cooling condition compared to the non-cooling condition, suggesting that cooling maybe enhances neural drive or muscle excitation to some of the muscles involved, working muscles, which then increases force output and increases your ability to perform more repetitions. So that was the results of that study. Before I go on, I'll let you interject or ask any questions if I didn't cover
Y-
anything.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, in that study too, there was also a lower RPE, right, for those subjects that maybe had the higher volume load output.
Yeah, so one of the studies, I think it was the one with females, the second one showed slightly lower RPE. I don't think it met like statistical significance, but so you could argue how if it was practically meaningful or not. But I think actually um have it right here. It was um yeah, so I think it was like less than a point. So we'll say something like 6.7 compared to like 5.8, 5.9. So nonetheless, definitely lower. And yeah, so that like some type of cooling application that maybe between sets or I don't know, it gives you like it makes you feel better, helps increase that recovery between sets. So that was some of the interpretation there.
Yeah, I wonder too, and maybe it's hard to parse out this data depending on the number of participants, obviously, but potentially there's an inter-individual variability as far as like how people respond to that sort of stimulation too. So that would be interesting is to actually see the data. Like, was somebody's RPE exactly the same, whereas somebody else's was a 3 from a 7 in the other condition, right? So that might be just an interesting, again, I'm just thinking of how you could potentially incorporate this, and obviously I want to talk about some of the potential mechanisms of why this might work. But I just think it'd be, again, is this going to change the game? Maybe not, but could be something cool to potentially use as like an interesting way to, keep things fun and exciting for clients or for training. Bring your igloo or your Yeti full of ice packs to the gym and just start cranking out some bench press. But what else were you going to say as far as studies and sort of results?
Yeah, and I will say too, to piggyback off that, what was interesting of the studies by Kwan, they actually showed, so let's say they like hit 8 reps in that first set or whatever. After the cooling, in the cooling group, they actually exceeded the amount of reps they performed in the first set in the second set. So like they got like 8 in the first set on average, they got like 9 in the second set, which is pretty interesting as well, because normally you'd expect a steady drop off. And they showed that, I believe they showed that in both studies. And then the non-cooling condition was as expected, a steady drop off with each set going down. But yeah, so after that, there was two studies by McMahon and colleagues that essentially looked at the same protocol. I think they used 80% of 1RM, whereas Kwan used 85% of 1RM. But same deal, had them come in. And this time they performed 3 different conditions. So there was two palm cooling conditions, one with 10 degrees Celsius, one with 15 degrees Celsius, and then there was a non-cooling condition as well. But again, they used that they controlled for that placebo effect by having a thermoneutral cooling application with the hand device as well. And their cooling protocol was a bit different in that they rested 3 minutes between sets, but only one of those 3 minutes was palm cooling. And the authors talk about in the paper as well that they opted for the 1 minute because that was the directions that the manufacturer gave, and the way in which the cooling device worked was a bit stronger in that I think it worked by conduction and convection and able to cool the palm, so it was a bit more potent, so that um, the manufacturer, I believe, recommended not to go much longer than 1 minute just because there could be a risk for vasoconstriction and potentially negative effects there.
Was
So
it the
they went with
beginning
one
of the
minute.
third, the 3 minutes, or the last minute? Do you know? Did they
The
talk
beginning.
the
I
beginning?
believe the
Okay,
beginning. Yeah.
gotcha,
I could double check that. I'm not positive, but I think it was either the beginning or like a middle interjectory period, like a transition
gotcha,
period and
gotcha.
then the 1 minute, I think. But either way, that's what they went with. And those results of that study showed no differences in all outcomes between conditions. So they looked at again, they looked at EMG, they looked at the amount of repetitions performed, and I want to say either heart rate in one of the studies and lactate as well. And it showed basically no difference between conditions.
So, what are
So
some
you have two studies, yeah.
Yeah,
Good,
big
yeah.
conflicting differences. No, that's good. So with all that in mind, and obviously there were a couple other studies in there, what are some of your takeaways? Like what do you think is a practical takeaway from this research review that people could take and be realistic about? Is this something worth incorporating? Is it not? Again, I'd love to talk about the mechanisms of potentially why it works, but is this something that's worth considering? Like how have your thoughts changed?
Yeah, so the way I look at it as, I mean, I've looked into this and I told you earlier on, like I haven't really implemented this in my own training. So I guess that kind of hints at it a little bit is that I wouldn't consider like a main thing. But again, the research seems to show either like a neutral to maybe a positive effect. So there's no downside to playing around with it. Especially I think we talk about in the practical applications part of the paper, like you could go ahead, try it out. You could mess around with different strategies, whether it be like sticking a cold pack in the freezer and going back and forth between hands, or maybe if you work out at home, getting like a bucket of water. If you work out at home and you have like a sink nearby, running your hands underneath water in between sets, something like that. I don't see there's nothing in the literature that shows a potential downside to doing it. So if it's something you care about getting a couple more reps and something you want to try and you can, it's not like a pain in the butt to do so, then I don't see why not. But I wouldn't going into it expecting to see a like 100% increase in the amount of reps you can perform or your 1 RM or anything like that.
Yeah, and this is the part where we have to caution people not to be an idiot and stick your hand in a bag of dry ice or something with the expectation that you're going to increase your 1 rep max. So don't be an idiot. Don't go past 3 minutes, let's say, and then probably don't use anything outside of like
No.
ice water. Talk to me a little bit about the mechanism. So some of the ones that I pulled out, and maybe I missed some here, or correct me or add on. There was maybe something about the acute stimulation of the central nervous system that created more output. The decreased rate of perceived exertion could potentially, long term with higher training volumes, allow greater resistance training volume, which we know is associated with better hypertrophy outcomes. And then potentially the rapid cooling of the core temp through the distal extremities, preventing overheating, which we know can lead to fatigue. I saw one that was cool that I had never even thought of, that the cooling blood helps with ATP production, which helps preserve
Yeah.
force production capacity, and then potentially limiting lactate accumulation, which could lead to less fatigue. Did I miss any? And then are there any of those that you think are potentially the main culprit and why this could potentially work?
Yeah, so no, I don't think you missed any. And before I even dive in, I'll go to say is these are all theories, and all the researchers that have proposed these theories do a good job in saying that like we really don't know. It's unclear, but this is just speculation as to potentially what the mechanisms could be if there actually is a ergogenic benefit to implementing this strategy for resistance training. But I guess I'll start with the one about the temperature control, just because that kind of explains why the palms and why the soles, right? Because the first thing I was wondering when I first dove into this literature, I was like, why the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet? Like, what's so special about these areas? And yeah, the reason is that because these areas contain these specialized vascular formations called arteriovenous anastomoses. For short, call them AVAs, and they play a major role in controlling body temperature. In that, when our core body temperature elevates, those areas, the AVAs, dilate and allow for a rapid increase in blood flow to the surface, the skin surface around those areas, and allow for heat exchange or for heat to be released, and thus decreasing preventing from rapid increases in core body temperature. So it allows us to efficiently cool our bodies, right? And it's been speculated that directly cooling those areas can actually increase the amount of cool blood circulated back toward the core and can and prevent rapid increases in core body temperature during exercise. So where this makes the most sense and where this has been shown to be effective in the literature is for sport performance or aerobic exercise in the heat, right? It makes sense. Like we were just talking about how you were saying that you would lift in that gym, right, where he would keep the temperature really low. And because when you're, I mean, summertime now, right, and a lot of sports, obviously with the Olympics coming out, they're played outside, and we can't always control the weather, so it might be really hot or humid day, and that can cause an increase in core body temperature when we're performing exercise. And sometimes extreme rises in core temperature can coincide with fatigue, um, and lead to impaired performance, right? So we don't want that. And there's some good evidence suggesting that maybe cooling our palms between like rest intervals between like repeated bouts of sprints in hot conditions can improve performance there. So there's some evidence for running that I'm aware about. I believe even some evidence for like a rowing machine or rowing ergometer of the amount of power output in certain sprint bouts of sprinting. So that makes sense in like hot conditions, right? Because that's when our core body temperature might actually be a limiting factor or contribute to fatigue. But what's interesting is a lot of this research on resistance training, it's all carried out in a thermoneutral environment, like most gyms or indoors where the outside temperature, those external factors shouldn't really play a big role in elevating our core body temperature. And a lot of the authors of these papers even say, even the Grand study who proposed a lot of these theories about the temperature regulation even says that like you wouldn't expect to see we don't see massive spikes in core body temperature when we do a couple sets of bench press even to failure. Like it's not comparable to performing aerobic exercise in the heat. So there's got to be something else going on here. That's where those neural mechanisms have also been suggested. So I don't know if you have anything to ask or input there before I touch on any of the other mechanisms, but
No, I think that's super interesting and something to potentially consider for our listeners who may also do activities outside, right? Like that just makes me think if you are outside running or you're outside or your kids are outside playing soccer or something, like having an ice bath potentially available for, especially little kids to potentially dunk their hands in or their feet in between, bouts or quarters or whatever it is could potentially be a good idea to increase safety, right? So no, that's just super interesting. Please continue.
yeah, no, and I like that you said that too, because again, it's important to consider the reason I talked about the aerobic exercise is because remember, this paper is solely focused on resistance training. So it's just the context of does palm cooling improve performance in resistance training? It has nothing to do with like there are some potentially more promising effects in outdoor sports that, where that core temperature can be more influential in hot conditions. But in terms of like a thermoneutral environment for resistance training, might not be the same mechanisms here. So um, I talked about some of like the EMG studies. There's some increased EMG amplitude or greater EMG amplitude during sets of like bench press or even I think leg press and squats as well with cooling compared to a non-cooling condition. So it's actually been proposed that maybe cooling can delay the signaling to the central nervous system of discomfort or like pain during a set to failure, and maybe that delay can allow you to perform more work than you otherwise would be without cooling. So that's been another theory as well, is that maybe you could get a couple more reps um, due to that delay in that pain response to the
Sort of
central
like
nervous
an
system during exercise.
anesthetic effect, kind of.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And again, this is very, very much speculation. Like this is again, there's also been like the two studies by McMahon. I think there's not all studies showed like an increase in or greater EMG amplitude with cooling, but it's just one of the proposed mechanisms that could be responsible. And they use that. So talked about that arousal scale as well. So they use like that as well as the RPE rating still also suggests that there could be some type of neural effect. It can also just be that cooling it makes you feel good when you're really exerting yourself, and that um, can make you feel like it makes you feel better and you can perform more work. So there's a couple different things to be explored there.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So I'd love to just sort of transition into kind of practical takeaways, and we've touched on a few of these. I don't think this is going to be a game changer for most people, but I still think it's super interesting. And again, something that if you're into trying new and different modalities, might be worth experimenting with, right? Especially, we talked about those climate neutral environments for listeners who maybe do have a garage gym and they don't have, a climate neutral environment in the summertime and it is 90 degrees in there. Like maybe having that bucket of ice water ready to go would actually show significant performance improvements, especially if you're doing something that's, maybe outside of the realm of traditional bodybuilding style. I'm taking 2 minutes in between each and every set. I'm more doing like a interval training routine. Like you've got different stations in your house, or you're doing an air bike plus so I could definitely see where this could be applicable and where people might want to try to apply this in their own workouts. Do you have any maybe best practices or ways for people to maybe incorporate this? I know we've sort of talked on a few, but just to reiterate some ways to sort of experiment with this on your own.
I First of all, I could not agree more with everything you just said. That's something I've been thinking about lately in terms of like I said, I'm working out in mostly in a garage gym now that I'm back home from New York. So it's summertime, it's getting hot. I work mostly in the mornings, so when I get my workouts in, it's usually peak temperature during the day. I'm in the hot garage, so this maybe it's something I might try with. And another thing that's important to note too is I think all these studies have only looked at just one exercise, right? So we're looking at the effects of 4 to 5, whatever it is, straight sets of a like bench press or whatever the exercise is. We're not looking at it, none of them looked at multi-exercise protocols. So I think it would be interesting to um, look at protocols that have like maybe a full body protocol or some type of workout that includes supersets or
Supersets with
certain
ice baths.
yeah.
Oh boy.
So again, I mean, to not to maybe a little teaser there, but it doesn't seem like supersets really impede performance at all. But maybe again, that's in the context of one study. So you can use these at your own discretion and experiment with them. Another avenue I see that could be fitting is maybe for CrossFit. They lift a
I
lot of
was
those people
just
lift
thinking
a
that
lot
all the
a lot of heavy.
boxes,
Yeah.
yep, that are just open garages. Yeah.
hmm and you could find, and again, I'm a big proponent of obviously interpreting the research, but research gives us an idea of how to apply that to practice. But anecdotal evidence is also can be important too. So there's a bunch of YouTube videos you can Google of people implementing cooling strategies as well. So I think some of them probably are CrossFitters, but that can really help because a lot of those CrossFit workouts are like a mix and match between more I guess cardio based exercise and lifting weights. So who knows? Maybe it could help there. In terms of how to practically apply this, I think yeah we touched on it a little bit earlier, but yeah maybe try to bring some type of cold water bottle, use that. But I will say too, I noted earlier that all the studies kept the temperature between 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, right? So the reason they do that is because it's been suggested that 15 degrees Celsius is cool enough, and that's just to give context and to convert. I'm not good at conversions, but I think that's like 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. And that's cool enough to elicit some type of cooling effect if there is one. But when you get start getting below 10 degrees Celsius, it starts to be too cold. I know you said earlier, like don't stick your hand in dry ice for more than like 3 minutes or whatever, but it's possible that that could induce vasoconstriction when it's super cold, and then it closes those blood vessels and doesn't allow heat to get out. So it could actually be compromised performance potentially. So just keeping that in mind as well. If you do, again, like if I were to use ice pack, I'm not pulling out a thermometer to check that. So what you could do is just pass it back and forth. That way, it doesn't spend a whole lot of time on that one area and doesn't bring down that or doesn't cause that vasoconstriction that we don't want. And another thing too is I think it's called AVA cooling technology, something like that. But there is one commercially available cooling device, and it's very practical from what I gathered. In that it's like kind of like a cylinder. If you almost think of like a hydro flask, but like a water bottle, and you can actually fill it up, and it'll keep. I believe from what I've read, it'll keep the temperature between that range for up to an hour. I think, and I think it has like a gauge on it, and it's just like a water bottle. So and there's videos of people using it in a commercial gym setting. So you could, I think it's like it's not unreasonably expensive. I think it's like $70. Um, so I mean, not cheap, but I mean, if you're willing to drop money on it just to try it out, then I guess that would be the best bet. And it seems to be the most practical way to apply it if you were to actually purchase something that could work. So there's that as well somewhere online. Again, I would use caution when getting it. I wouldn't go into it expecting your performance to have like a huge performance boost. But if you're something you want to try out, that could be a potential avenue to explore.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reminder just as we sort of wrap up here too, that we're not talking about extremely cold water, right? So 50 degrees is cold, right? If you put your full body in there, that's very cold. But it's not, 32-degree ice bath, right? So being cautious and maybe using shorter time frames, or like you said, passing something back and forth. I could foresee, like, if you've got a 2-minute rest period, say you're at home, maybe that lasts, or in between, like you said, if it's 2 minutes, maybe you do, I don't know, 30 seconds in between where you're dunking your hands or your feet into an ice bath kind of thing, giving your body a little bit of time to warm back up before you go into that next set. So experiment, see if this is something that works for you, and obviously be careful. Don't be an idiot. What else are you working on, Ryan? I know you've got a big paper that just came out. That is your master's thesis, if I'm correct. Why don't you give us a little teaser on that one? This is the traditional versus supersets. Tell us just a little bit about that, because we will have you back on, hopefully, to discuss that one in more detail as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for giving that a shout out. But yeah, so we just wrapped up data collection on this a couple months ago and got the preprint out. So it's not officially through peer review yet, but we essentially looked at a full body resistance training protocol. So bench press, lat pull down, leg extension, leg curl, and then biceps curl, triceps push down. And we had recruited 50 subjects and had half of them in the straight sets group, or traditional sets group, and then the other half was in the supersets. So the superset group performed agonist antagonist supersets. So for example, they perform a set of lat pull down, immediately go over to the bench press, Smith bench press, and then perform a set of that, then rest 2 minutes and repeat that. Whereas the traditional sets group just did everything as straight sets. So one set of lat pull down, rest 2 minutes, another set of lat pull down, repeat for a total of 4 sets per exercise. So, and we looked at volume load acutely. We looked at RPE, rating of perceived exertion of the entire session. What else? We looked at training time. We looked at strength changes, power changes, and then isometric and dynamic maximal strength, as well as muscular endurance. So took a bunch of different outcomes to look at there. So it was a cool study, and it was also in trained subjects as well. So it was the first study to look at supersets in trained individuals, as well as utilize a training protocol that we talked about, multi-exercise training protocols that utilized a full body type regimen. So that's kind of a sneak peek on that. And then, like you alluded to earlier, is also currently going on now a lengthened partial study in the lab. So I haven't been able to be there much at all, but it's being carried out by the data collection process is being led by my friend Alec Pinheiro, as well as a bunch of also other awesome graduate students at Lehman in the AMDL lab. And also Dr. Pack and Dr. Milo Wolf are main contributors to this project as well. I think Milo and Pack mostly designed the methods and came up with the idea for the study. So really cool study there, looking at upper body changes in strength and muscle growth, looking at directly comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion. And I will say too, in resistance trained individuals. So definitely interested. That's currently ongoing right now. So definitely interested to see the results of that when that comes out in a couple months.
Yeah, I'm super excited to see that one as well. And the study I really want to see is blood pressure cuff or blood flow restriction. Well, you've got one hand in an ice bath, and then you're doing lengthen partial biceps. So that's the next one. You should do that for your PhD. No, that's super interesting, man.
Yeah,
I really appreciate you giving us that sneak peek, and super excited to see all that stuff. And obviously, as any of this, it seems like the length and partials are changing the game a little bit. I mean, that's something I've been incorporating for quite a while now. But shout out to Dr.
same.
Milo for really leading sort of the movement in that. But most of this stuff is just us nerding out. I think just work hard and be consistent, and you'll see most of the gains you're going to get in the gym. And that's sort of what I've learned over the years, the longer I've been doing this. But it is cool, for people like you and me and some of our listeners to think like, oh well, maybe that'll add an extra 2% to my bench press max or whatever it might be. So I appreciate you doing the Lord's work out there, and we're excited to see what you come up with at Rutgers. And how can people learn a little bit more a little more about you if they're interested? Is you want to share IG, email, anything like that for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. My Instagram is Ryan Burke, Burke 33. And then you could also find me for the nerds out there on my ResearchGate profile as well as all the research we put out from the AMDL lab or AMD lab. So those are the two main ways you can find me. But yeah, man, I really appreciate you having me on. It was awesome getting to talk about all the studies and upcoming studies we have coming out, and hopefully I'd love to be back soon.
Yeah,
So.
no, it was my pleasure, Ryan, and we'll definitely have you back. I'm super excited to talk about that other stuff, and this is just really interesting. And you guys really are doing the best research out there. Basically, everything that comes out of Lehman is worth talking about. So I'm excited to continue to see what you guys pump out. So thank you everyone for listening. Please like, follow, and subscribe. Give Ryan a follow on Instagram as well, and we look forward to much more awesome research coming out of New York and New Jersey. So you guys have a great rest of your day. And thanks so much for listening. Awesome.